Welcome to this episode in our series on Monarchy in Peril. I'm Cindy McCreary, an Associate Professor of History at the University of Sydney, Australia, and a Director of the Modern Monarchy and Global Perspective Research Hub.
And I'm Robert Aldrich, a Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Sydney.
In this series, we've been focusing on various challenges that endangered monarchies and sometimes overturned them in both Europe and Asia. If you've just joined us, we hope that you'll find this and indeed all of the episodes in this series of interest. In today's episode, we concentrate on Africa. In pre-colonial days, Africa had many hereditary rulers. Now, Europeans often dismiss these rulers as mere chiefs of what they called tribes. But in fact, African hereditary rulers often had similar powers and privileges as their European counterparts. New perspectives on these monarchies give the lie to racist foreign stereotypes of African backwardness and barbarity, and any notion that Africa was a fixed and unchanging society before the arrival of Europeans. African kings and indeed queens, now reigning queens were less common but not unknown, and female members of royal families exercised considerable power, certainly faced many local challenges. Then the arrival of the Europeans from the 1500s brought new challenges, including the might of mechanized weaponry and the rapacious desire of Europeans for African trade goods such as gold and ivory. There was also a European desire for slave labor, and the horrific Atlantic slave trade, which exported millions of people, many from West Africa to the Americas, lasted until the mid-1800s. Ironically, not so long after the formal end of this slave trade, there began in earnest the late 19th century scramble for Africa. European powers divided up almost all of the African continent into colonies, ruled by Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and Italy. In the process, most of the indigenous African monarchies were overturned, their kings and their families sometimes killed in war or sent into exile. In this podcast, we'd like to focus on two case studies, namely the Ethiopian monarchy and the Zulu kingdom in South Africa. Let's begin by turning to my colleague, Professor Emeritus Robert Aldrich, to tell us more about Ethiopia. Robert, in your book entitled The Colonial World, which you've co-authored with Andreas Stucki, you have a chapter on the Italian conquest of Ethiopia and the overthrow of its emperor, Haile Selassie. Can you tell us a bit more about his dynasty and about Ethiopia's history?
The dynasty that ruled Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was also called, formally took power in the 13th century. But many Ethiopians claimed that the lineage was much older and that the founder of the dynasty was the son of the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Ethiopia has had a number of sometimes warring ethnic groups and regions and several religions, including Islam. The ruling dynasty, however, was Christian. And for Europeans, the very presence of a Christian kingdom in this part of Africa was itself fascinating. In the 19th century, Ethiopia's strategic presence on the Horn of Africa, near the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, gave it new importance in world affairs and also in trade. Ethiopia's main export, after all, became coffee. And indeed, Ethiopians say that coffee drinking originated in their country.
So let me guess, did the Europeans begin to meddle in Ethiopia?
Quite so. In the late 1860s, for example, the British sent in a military expedition on the grounds that Emperor Tawadros II was holding several Englishmen hostage. British soldiers attacked, and the emperor chose to commit suicide rather than fall into the British hands. But the British then kidnapped his 7-year-old son, Prince Alamayu. They spirited him away to London, where he became a favorite of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria sponsored his education at the famous rugby school. She no doubt hoped to turn him into a model black and Christian English gentleman. He was then briefly at Sandhurst, the military academy. Unfortunately, he died of pleurisy at the age of 18. He's in fact buried at Windsor Castle, one of the royal residences, but many Ethiopians would like for his remains to be returned to his homeland. His story, for those who are interested in the rest of British actions at this period, recently been told, incidentally, in a book by Andrew Heavens with the title The Prince and the Plunder.
What a poignant story, Robert. But the British didn't take over Ethiopia, did they?
No, they didn't, though they maintained various interests in Ethiopia. Turned out that in the 1890s, it was the Italians who tried to take over Ethiopia. Italy was a relatively newly unified country, and like other great powers or would-be great powers, it wanted colonies. So the Italian monarch sent in troops. But the Ethiopians trounced the Italian invasion army in what was a really humiliating military defeat for the Europeans. The Italians had to withdraw, and Ethiopia remained independent until the 1930s. And by that time, Haile Selassie had become emperor.
Now, Haile Selassie was very well known internationally, wasn't he? Was he an important figure for the African diaspora?
He was an important figure in Europe and in particular for those of African descent overseas. In 1924, Haile Selassie toured Europe before he had become emperor. He was young, he was charismatic, he was Christian, and yet he was exotic. And so this future African emperor attracted enormous attention in the public and in the press, and particularly for those in the African diaspora, because he would be the ruler of just one of two African countries that had not been colonized and which thus remained independent. Now, as you can imagine, that fact had great resonance among other colonized people of African descent and in the African populations in the United States, in Britain, and in other places, these populations that were largely formed of descendants of enslaved Africans. So Haile Selassie became well known, and he became a powerful symbol of African identity. His coronation in a very grand ceremony in the Ethiopian capital in 1930 attracted further attention, and it was attended by a whole cohort of distinguished guests from overseas, including representatives of other monarchs, like the Duke of Gloucester, who was the son and representative of the British King George V.
Clearly a moment of triumph for the Ethiopian emperor. But then the Italians marched in again, didn't they?
5 years after Haile Selassie's coronation, the Italians invaded again. This time, the soldiers were sent by the fascist leader Mussolini, who wanted to reverse the defeat of the 1890s. Italian soldiers conquered the country, and they set up what was really a very brutal colonial regime. The dethroned emperor, Haile Selassie, fled into exile. And in a really very powerful speech in Geneva, he made an appeal for action against the Italians at the League of Nations Assembly. Their response was weak. Other powers, including those who had their own colonies in Africa, didn't want to offend the Italians and were concerned about independent countries in Africa. Haile Selassie temporarily settled in Britain, where he had a great deal of support from private groups who were sympathetic with Ethiopia's plight and rejected this naked aggression of Italy in Ethiopia. Haile Selassie stood as a worldwide figure of resistance against fascism, but also of African culture and resilience. It was during the 1930s that even took on a new cultural and spiritual form with the emergence of Rastafarianism in Jamaica, British colony with a large population of African descent who created this new spirituality centered on Emperor Haile Selassie. Rastafarianism lives on, of course, and is well known because of reggae music. Haile Selassie himself was able to regain his throne, somewhat unusually for exiled monarchs, with the defeat of the Italians by the Allies in the Second World War, and he thus continued to rule and continued to be an icon of black power.
What a fascinating history, and that link between an African emperor and Caribbean music is just so momentous, isn't it? So, very unusually then for a dethroned monarch, Haile Selassie returned to power. But what happened after that to him and to Ethiopia?
In the 1950s and 60s, Haile Selassie still had a great deal of support, particularly in the West. He was thought of as a modernizing ruler in his country. As his reign wore on, there was rising discontent within Ethiopia. There was dissatisfaction because of poverty, poor economic conditions, and also because of the rather authoritarian style of Haile Selassie's regime. The 1970s were also years of radicalism in many former colonies and elsewhere in the world. And in September 1974, there was a coup in Ethiopia. It was led by a military clique. They installed a Soviet-backed junta, and they formally abolished the old dynasty. Some of the members of Haile Selassie's family fled overseas. He was kept in detention and died in August 1975.
Robert, thank you so much for sharing your insights on the Ethiopian emperor with us. Really an amazing story. As we've just heard, Haile Selassie thus had the dubious honour of having been dethroned twice, once by foreign colonizers, but once by his own subjects. Another African king who was twice kicked off his throne, though his dynasty has survived, was the Zulu monarch of South Africa.
We're joined now by Dr. Hilary Sapire, reader in modern history at Birkbeck in the University of London. Hilary is a distinguished scholar of Southern African history and also of monarchy on the African continent.
This interview was recorded using Zoom.
Hilary, the Zulu dynasty was one of the most important and most famous in Africa. The battles fought between the British and the Zulus were indeed some of the most legendary in the whole chronicle of colonial wars. Could you tell us a bit more about the Zulus and their kingdom?
The Zulu kingdom is probably the best known and easily recognizable of the African kingdoms, and it came to European knowledge as a consequence in 1879 of the very spectacular defeat of the British colonial forces at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879. As a consequence, became renowned and certainly associated in the British popular imagination with this extraordinary military prowess and for a very grand and detailed monarchical tradition. So they are both important in terms of the reputation of African kings, but also within the internal political developments of Southern African histories of kingship. The Zulu were spectacularly successful in absorbing and dominating competing neighboring chiefdoms throughout this period. And they adopted many of the military techniques and governance techniques of other competing confederacies and states.
What about the success that the Zulus had, and also the reverses, in resisting the Europeans who took over South Africa?
I think that they are renowned for that military prowess, which was certainly a very unusual event in that era. But ultimately, the same year, they were spectacularly defeated. And this is for a number of reasons, but in part they were outgunned. They only had access to quite dated muzzle-loaded guns, and they had to compete against the most modern and sophisticated British weaponry. Ultimately, coherence of the Zulu kingdom through the symbolism of the monarchy was extraordinarily effective in the capacity of people to hold on to a very distinctive political and cultural identity. I think the other point to make is that they were allowed to retain access to their land. So I would say a combination of cultural resistance and a capacity to hold on to their land, which was part of the military agreement, meant that there was considerable effectiveness in resisting white or British colonial hegemony. On the other hand, the royal power was eviscerated initially as a consequence of destruction of the, well, The destruction of the monarchy meant that they no longer had the king at the head of the nation in terms of the political structures, but I think in terms of the imagination and political loyalties, the king remained important symbolically. And this continued well into the 20th century, despite the exile of both Setishwayo and his descendant.
You're listening to Monarchy in Peril from the University of Sydney, and today's guest is Hilary Sapire.
One king was deposed twice among the Zulus. This was the Zulu king Setshwayo, who was deposed and restored, but had lost much of his kingdom. What was the fate of the Zulu monarchy after that, including under the apartheid regime?
Setishwayo was first deposed and exiled initially to Cape Town. What was quite interesting about this period was that very soon after his deposition and exile and the literal partition of Zululand into 13 separate statelets or kinglets, if you like, there was a reaction amongst humanitarians based both in South Africa and in Britain, and a real campaign for his restoration. He himself was very active in self-publicizing and in agitating for the return of the monarchy. It was as a consequence of the humanitarian interventions and also a new government in Britain that resulted in his very famous visit to London in 1882. And he had the opportunity of meeting with politicians and indeed with Queen Victoria herself, where he sought to plead for the return of the monarchy and to the restoration of its rightful place, and in some sense to reverse the settlement that followed the war. Setishwayo was never fully restored to power. In the end, he died in yet another internal conflict. His own son, who succeeded him, Zulu, was very soon himself sent into exile, this time to St. Helena.
What about the Zulu monarchy in the last decades of the 19th century, when the British were expanding further in southern Africa?
The kingship does become something of a pawn well into the period of apartheid and immediate post-apartheid period, where competing interests seek to mobilize and use the majesty and the mystique of Zulu monarchy. I think it's important to mention that on the one hand, both segregation and apartheid sought to undermine the power and the authority of the Zulu kingship, but they never entirely were able to extinguish its moral authority, its symbolic authority, and in some ways this worked for them and in various governments as well. The important point to make is that the form of kingship prepared to tolerate was not one which accorded with the desires and aspirations of Zulu nationalists and Zulu leaders, because it always was curtailed in its power. It was also very much reduced to its ornamental role rather than one that reflected its pre-colonial power and authority. It was always a mobilizing symbol and very, very effectively one. In the apartheid era, herein lies one of the supreme ironies, in that it was under apartheid that Zulu kingship was finally recognized by the state, and not merely as the head of the Usuthu faction, one of the many factions of the Zulu peoples.
Hilary, can you tell us, please, what happens to the Zulu monarchy during the notorious apartheid era of South Africa in the mid to late 20th century?
Monarchy does have a very interesting and contradictory role in the era of apartheid, because the apartheid era, to some extent, is characterized by this attempt to create spuriously independent Bantustans or self-governing statelets. And it was certainly the design of the apartheid government to use the monarchy as a means of legitimizing this effective balkanization of South Africa into these spurious ethnic states. The king certainly had a role to play in this, and there was a contradictory gain for the monarchy in that under the previous regimes, the Zulu monarchy was never fully recognized or acknowledged, but under apartheid it was given on its status, but certainly for the purpose of promoting the identification of Zulu ethnicity and for balkanizing in ethnic terms the South African state. So there was certainly something to be gained by the monarchy, and certainly something to be gained by Zulu nationalists in some forms of cooperation. And so there was a sense in which some of the benefits were accepted.
Today, the Zulu monarchy has an official status in South Africa and is recognized by the government. In 2021, a new ruler, Misuzulu Zulu Kazwalatini, was crowned as the most recent Zulu king in a grand traditional ceremony. Tell us something about that coronation and about the new king and his role and importance for the Zulus and in South Africa.
It's another fascinating story and chapter in the history of the Zulu monarchy. The last king, Goodwill Zwelithini, indeed did die in 2021, and this was followed by some more bitter successionist disputes and controversy. There was a very, very brief regency that was set up before the succession of the current Zulu king, Misuzulu, who was installed in 2022. It still has a power and a force and a majesty at the coronation ceremony that took place in the football stadium in Durban, where the World Cup football matches were played, was a very spectacular event and one of these sort of hybrid pastiche kind of ceremonies with traditional dancing and Izibongo recited praise poems to the new monarch, and a ceremony that was presided over by the current President Cyril Ramaphosa, who symbolically handed over the certificate to the new king, acknowledging and recognizing his accession to power as the new Zulu king within the South African democracy.
These two case studies that we've just heard about, namely Ethiopia and the Zulu kingdom, give us just a brief introduction to the multiplicity and diversity of African kingdoms. But they do show the trials and tribulations of African kings, especially in the face of colonial occupation. They also show the resilience of monarchs, dynasties, and traditions of African governance, culture, and spirituality in the face of all the challenges that Africans faced. Thank you to both Dr. Hilary Sapire and to my colleague Professor Emeritus Robert Aldridge for sharing their expertise on African monarchy with us today. Please join us next time when our topic is decolonization. This series of podcasts has been created by the Modern Monarchy and Global Perspective Research Hub at the University of Sydney. Please see our website for further information at global-modern-monarchy.sydney.edu.au. The texts of the podcasts were written by Associate Professor Cindy McCreary and Professor Emeritus Robert Aldridge, and the series was produced by Peter Adams from the University of Sydney School of Humanities. The podcasts are copyright by the University of Sydney, and the authors and interviewees retain rights to their material. We acknowledge the Indigenous Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Sydney stands.